The unraveling of promises. The sprawling Bennett estate exuded a sense of cold opulence. Its vast halls, marble floors, and towering ceilings were testaments to wealth accumulated over decades, yet they felt devoid of life, like a museum closed to the public. At the center of it all sat Alexander Bennett, a man whose every gesture spoke of power and precision. His tailored navy suit was pristine, his silver cufflinks glinting in the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the grand windows. Alexander had built an empire, one negotiation, and one ruthless decision at a time. But today, he wasn't sealing a deal or expanding his vast conglomerate. Instead, he was finalizing something far more personal, a divorce. Across the room, at the other end of an ornate dining table that could seat 20, sat Charlotte, his wife of 15 years. The years had been kind to her physically, but the emotional strain of the last 5 years was evident in the faint lines around her eyes and the guarded expression she wore like armor. Charlotte sat with quiet dignity, her posture as straight as a rod. She wore a simple yet elegant cream blouse and black slacks, a stark contrast to the glamorous gowns she used to favor during their gala-filled years together. The divorce papers lay between them, a thin stack of legalese that represented the end of a life, once filled with dreams and promises. "You've already made up your mind," Charlotte said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, though a tremor lurked beneath. "So let's not drag this out." Alexander glanced at her, his dark eyes narrowing. She wasn't pleading, wasn't begging, as some part of him had almost expected. Instead, there was something unsettling in her composure, as if she had already processed the loss and was far ahead of him in letting go. "This is for the best," he said, leaning back in his chair. His words were measured, his tone detached. "We've been living separate lives for years, Charlotte. It's just the final step." Charlotte's lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "You mean you started living a separate life," she corrected, her gaze unflinching. "With her." Her. Sophia Lancaster. The name hung unspoken between them like an unwelcome guest. Sophia, the bright, young socialite who had swept into Alexander's life like a summer storm, leaving chaos in her wake. Sophia, with her sparkling laugh and her relentless need for attention, who had made Alexander feel alive again, or so he thought. Alexander didn't deny it. He couldn't. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Charlotte, we've grown apart. You know that." "No, Alex," Charlotte replied, her voice gaining strength. "You've grown apart. I stayed. I waited. I hoped." Her words were sharp, cutting through Alexander's carefully crafted defenses. For a brief moment, he saw the pain behind her calm facade, and it unsettled him. But he quickly brushed the feeling aside. He had convinced himself that this was necessary, that leaving Charlotte and their life together was the only way to pursue the happiness he deserved. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. "Do you think she'll stay?" she asked, her voice deceptively soft. "Do you think she's in it for you, Alex? Or is it for the power, the status, the money?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "This isn't about her, isn't it?" Charlotte countered, raising an eyebrow. She sat back, exhaling deeply. "It doesn't matter anymore. You've already made your choice." With a steady hand, she reached for the pen lying on top of the divorce papers. Her signature, when it came, was fluid and graceful, as if she were signing off on just another document. But as she pushed the papers toward Alexander, she met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something unexpected. "Freedom. You think you're walking away from me," she said quietly. "But in truth, Alex, I think you're walking away from yourself." The words stayed with him long after Charlotte had left the room. 2 years later, Alexander Bennett was living the life he had imagined during those late-night meetings with Sophia. Their world was one of extravagant vacations, lavish parties, and endless indulgences. Sophia's energy was intoxicating, her laughter infectious. They had become the golden couple of the social elite, gracing magazine covers and dominating gossip columns. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. The thrill of their whirlwind romance had faded. Sophia, once captivated by Alexander's success and maturity, now seemed restless. She spent more and more nights out with friends, her Instagram littered with pictures of rooftop parties and exotic destinations where Alexander was conspicuously absent. For Alexander, the emptiness was harder to ignore. The life he had built with Sophia felt hollow, a facade that failed to mask the growing void within him. The money, the parties, the prestige, none of it filled the space left by Charlotte, or the deeper emptiness that had been growing long before their marriage had ended. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alexander found himself walking aimlessly through Central Park, seeking a reprieve from the relentless pace of his life. The vibrant colors of the trees, their leaves ablaze with shades of red and gold, were a stark contrast to the gray monotony he felt inside. He was about to turn back toward his waiting car when something caught his eye. In a quiet corner of the park, beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, sat a woman surrounded by children. She was reading aloud from a picture book, her voice carrying softly over the autumn breeze. The children, 4 of them, all close in age, were laughing, their joy unrestrained and contagious. Alexander froze. The woman was Charlotte. And the children. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't look away. Each child bore an undeniable resemblance to him. The sharp cheekbones, the dark hair, the intense eyes. They were his. There was no question. As the realization hit him, a surge of emotions overwhelmed him. Shock, confusion, and something deeper, more primal. A sense of loss. How had he not known? How could this have happened without him? Charlotte glanced up and saw him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Alexander felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. Instead, she offered him a small, enigmatic smile before turning her attention back to the children. Alexander stood there, rooted to the spot, as 1,000 questions raced through his mind. The laughter of the children echoed around him, a haunting melody that he couldn't escape. For the first time in years, Alexander Bennett, the man who always knew his next move, found himself completely and utterly lost. A glimpse into what could have been. The image of Charlotte sitting in the park with the 4 children refused to leave Alexander's mind. He replayed the scene over and over, searching for answers he hadn't thought to ask in the moment. Their faces, the children's faces, haunted him. The sharp cheekbones, the dark hair, the piercing eyes. His features echoed back at him through time and circumstance. For 2 days, Alexander grappled with the revelation. Questions churned in his mind. Were they truly his? Had Charlotte intentionally kept them from him? Or had he been so absorbed in his new life with Sophia that he had simply missed the signs? The thought was unbearable, but it clung to him like a shadow. On the 3rd day, Alexander made a decision. He needed answers, and the only person who could provide them was Charlotte. The familiar address of Charlotte's home felt like an unexpected punch to the gut. She had traded their sprawling estate for a modest but charming townhouse on a quiet, tree-lined street. The simplicity of the home spoke volumes. It was a stark contrast to the opulence she once shared with Alexander. He hesitated before knocking on the door, his hand hovering just inches from the knocker. When the door finally opened, Charlotte stood before him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't surprised to see him, but neither was she welcoming. "Alexander," she said evenly, crossing her arms. "What are you doing here?" For the first time in years, Alexander felt small. His carefully crafted confidence faltered under her calm, steely gaze. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lower than he intended. Charlotte studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in," she said, her tone neutral. The interior of the townhouse was warm and inviting, filled with soft light and subtle touches of Charlotte's personality. Photos lined the mantel, photos of the children at various ages, their smiles bright and unrestrained. There were no traces of Alexander in the space. "Do you want tea?" Charlotte asked, motioning toward the kitchen. He shook his head, his throat tight. "No, thank you." She nodded and gestured for him to sit. "You have 5 minutes," she said, taking a seat across from him. Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "The children, are they mine?" Charlotte's gaze didn't waver. "Yes," she said simply. The single word was like a blow to the chest. It confirmed what he already knew, but hadn't allowed himself to fully accept. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you let me be a part of their lives?" Charlotte exhaled slowly, her eyes softening just slightly. "You left, Alexander," she said. "You didn't just leave me. You left everything we built. Our life, our home, and any chance of a future together. I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd care. You were too busy chasing something you thought was better." Her words cut deeper than he expected, but he didn't argue. She was right. At the time, he had convinced himself that leaving was the best thing for everyone. He had been so consumed by his desire for freedom, for something new, that he hadn't stopped to consider the consequences. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I was selfish and blind, and I didn't see what I was giving up until it was too late." Charlotte studied him carefully. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you here, Alexander? What do you want?" He hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I saw you in the park with them, and it made me realize what I've missed. I want to know them, Charlotte. I want to be a part of their lives." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she looked away. When she turned back to him, her eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "They're good kids," she said. "Smart, kind, and full of life. They don't know about you, not really. They've grown up thinking their father wasn't interested in being part of their lives. I've tried to protect them from the truth, to give them stability and love. I want to fix it," Alexander said quickly. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to try." Charlotte's gaze softened, but she didn't let him off the hook. "Fixing this won't be easy," she said. "It's not just about showing up once and expecting everything to fall into place. If you want to be in their lives, you'll have to earn it. You'll have to prove to them, and to me, that you're here for the right reasons." "I will," Alexander said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." Charlotte regarded him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll give you a chance. But the children come first, always. If they don't want you in their lives, you'll have to respect that." "I understand," Alexander said, relief washing over him. "Good," she said, standing. "They'll be home from school soon. You can stay and meet them, but don't overwhelm them. Let them set the pace." Alexander nodded, his heart pounding as the reality of the situation sank in. He was about to meet his children, 4 lives that had existed without him for years. When the front door opened, the sound of laughter and excited chatter filled the house. The children burst in, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, their faces flushed with the energy of youth. "Mom," called out the eldest, a girl with sharp cheekbones and a serious expression. She froze when she noticed Alexander standing in the living room. "Who's this?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice calm. "Kids, this is Alexander," she said. "He's someone important I want you to meet." The children exchanged confused glances. The youngest, a boy with bright, curious eyes, stepped forward boldly. "Are you Mom's friend?" he asked. Alexander crouched down to their level, a nervous smile on his face. "Not exactly," he said. "I'm your father." The room fell silent. The children stared at him, their expressions ranging from shock to suspicion. The eldest crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "You're our dad?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "Yes," Alexander said. "And I know that might be hard to believe. I haven't been around, and I'm sorry for that. But I'd like to change that, if you'll let me." The youngest tilted his head. "Why weren't you here before?" Alexander hesitated, glancing at Charlotte, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Because I made a mistake," he said honestly. "A big one. I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong. And I've missed so much because of it." The eldest girl, still skeptical, narrowed her eyes. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," Alexander said, his voice steady. "I just want to get to know you, to be part of your lives, if you'll let me." The children exchanged glances again. The youngest stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing his hesitation. "What's your favorite color?" he asked. Alexander blinked, surprised by the question. "Blue," he said after a moment. "What's yours?" "Green," the boy said with a grin. "You're okay, I guess." The other children didn't say much, but their guarded expressions softened slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, as Alexander left the townhouse, he felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. The bridges we build. Alexander couldn't sleep that night. The meeting with his children replayed in his mind on an endless loop, their hesitant glances, the guarded questions, and the flickers of curiosity that peeked through their caution. Each moment felt like a fragile thread, dangling between possibility and rejection. His youngest son's bold question, "What's your favorite color?" had stayed with him. It was so simple, yet it felt like an olive branch, an invitation to step into their world. But his eldest daughter's sharp gaze and pointed question, "What do you want from us?" lingered even more. He couldn't fault her for her skepticism. She was the one who had likely seen the most, who remembered the life he had left behind. Alexander resolved to take things slowly, but he knew that effort alone wouldn't be enough. Trust had to be earned, and he needed to demonstrate his commitment, not just speak it into existence. The following weekend, Alexander found himself back at Charlotte's doorstep, holding a large tote bag filled with carefully selected items. He had spent days researching what might appeal to each child. A beginner's telescope for Clara, the eldest, to match her curious and serious demeanor. A set of art supplies for Lily, the quiet middle child who had barely spoken during their first meeting. A puzzle kit for Leo, the enthusiastic boy who seemed eager to explore. And for Max, the youngest, an outdoor adventure kit with a compass and magnifying glass, perfect for a budding adventurer. When the door opened, it was Clara who answered. She looked up at him, her expression neutral but wary. "You're back," she said, stepping aside to let him in without another word. Alexander nodded, stepping inside. The other children quickly gathered in the living room, their energy filling the space. Charlotte stayed in the background, her presence a quiet reminder that he was still on trial. "I brought something for each of you," Alexander said, placing the bag on the coffee table. Clara crossed her arms. "We don't need presents," she said flatly. "I know," Alexander replied, meeting her gaze. "These aren't about what you need. They're about showing you that I've been thinking about you, about who you are, and what you might like. I hope I got it right." The tension in the room shifted. Slowly, cautiously, the children moved toward the bag. Max was the first to dig in, pulling out the adventure kit with wide eyes. "Cool," he exclaimed, examining the compass and the magnifying glass with fascination. Leo followed, pulling out the puzzle kit and grinning. "I love puzzles," he said, already opening the box to inspect its contents. Lily hesitated before reaching for the art supplies. Her fingers brushed over the sketch pads and colored pencils, and a small smile tugged at her lips. Clara was the last. She picked up the telescope carefully, her expression softening as she studied the sleek design. "A telescope?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. Alexander nodded. "I thought you might like exploring the stars. I used to have one when I was your age." Clara didn't respond immediately, But she didn't put the telescope down either. Instead, she glanced at him with a flicker of something that might have been approval. Over the next few hours, Alexander stayed, observing his children as they engaged with their gifts. Max insisted on dragging him outside to test the compass, leading Alexander on an impromptu expedition around the neighborhood. Leo peppered him with questions as he worked on the puzzle, his natural curiosity shining through. "Did you always like puzzles?" he asked. "I did," Alexander said with a smile. "They're a bit like life. Sometimes messy, but when you figure it out, it all comes together." Lily remained quiet, but occasionally showed Alexander her sketches. He praised her work sincerely, marveling at the detail and emotion in her drawings. "You're really talented," he told her, and for the first time, she looked up and met his eyes, her shy smile more pronounced. Clara stayed at a distance, fiddling with the telescope in silence. But later, as the sky darkened, she called out, "Dad, can you help me set this up?" The word Dad struck Alexander like a lightning bolt. It was the first time any of them had called him that. He quickly joined her, guiding her through the setup and showing her how to adjust the focus. They spent an hour outside, pointing out constellations and marveling at the moon's craters. "You really know a lot about this," Clara said, her tone less guarded than before. "I had a lot of practice," Alexander admitted. "It was one of the few things that made me feel connected to something bigger when I was younger." Clara nodded, and for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding. By the time Alexander left that evening, he felt a tentative sense of progress. The children were warming to him in their own ways, each interaction building a small bridge over the chasm of his absence. But he knew the road ahead would still be difficult. Charlotte walked him to the door, her expression softer than it had been in years. "You're doing better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you for giving me the chance," Alexander replied earnestly. She hesitated before speaking again. "Just remember, Alex, this isn't about you. It's about them. They've lived without you for a long time, and they're still figuring out how to let you in. Don't rush them." "I won't," Alexander promised. The weeks that followed were filled with small but meaningful steps forward. Alexander spent more time with the children, slowly integrating himself into their lives. He attended Leo's school science fair, where the boy proudly showed off his volcano project. He helped Max build a treehouse in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the air as they worked side by side. Lily grew bolder in sharing her artwork, even asking for Alexander's opinion on her latest pieces. And Clara, though still guarded, began to seek his advice on everything from homework to telescope adjustments. Each moment felt like a victory, but Alexander was careful not to take them for granted. He knew the trust he was building was fragile, and he was determined not to break it. One evening, as he was helping Lily pack away her art supplies, she looked up at him and asked, "Are you staying this time?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He knelt down to her level, meeting her gaze. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm staying. I'll be here for you, for all of you, as long as you'll have me." Lily studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," she said quietly. Despite the progress, Alexander knew there was one bridge he hadn't yet crossed: the past. Clara's lingering skepticism reminded him that the wounds of his absence hadn't fully healed. He needed to address the mistakes he had made, not just with words, but with actions. For the first time in years, Alexander felt like he had something worth fighting for. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. Confronting the shadows, despite the progress Alexander had made with his children, the specter of the past continued to loom over him. Clara, the eldest, still watched him with a guarded skepticism, her sharp questions a constant reminder of the trust he had yet to earn. Lily, though warming to him, still hesitated to fully let down her guard. Leo and Max were more openly accepting, but even their enthusiasm carried an unspoken question. "Will you stay this time?" Charlotte's warnings echoed in Alexander's mind. "This isn't about you. It's about them." It had become his mantra. grounding him as he navigated the delicate process of reintegrating himself into their lives. A day of reckoning. One chilly Saturday morning, Alexander arrived at Charlotte's house to pick up the children for a planned outing. The plan was simple: a day at the local science museum, followed by lunch at a kid-friendly cafe. But when he arrived, only 3 of the children were ready. "Where's Clara?" Alexander asked, noting her absence. Charlotte sighed, glancing toward the stairs. "She doesn't want to go today," she said. "She said she has homework, but I think she's avoiding you." Alexander felt a pang of disappointment but nodded. "I'll talk to her," he said, setting down the bag he had brought. Charlotte hesitated but stepped aside. "Good luck," she said. Alexander climbed the stairs, his heart pounding. He knocked gently on Clara's bedroom door. "Come in," came her voice, muffled but clear. He opened the door to find her sitting at her desk, surrounded by textbooks and notebooks. She didn't look up as he entered, her pen moving methodically across the page. "Clara," Alexander began, his voice soft. "Your siblings are ready to go. Are you sure you don't want to come?" "I told Mom I'm busy," she replied, not looking at him. Alexander stepped closer, pulling up a chair to sit across from her. "I think there's more to it than that," he said gently. Clara finally looked up, her expression a mixture of frustration and something deeper: hurt. "Why do you care so much now?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You didn't care before." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You're right," he admitted. "I wasn't there for you, and I can't change that. But I want to be here now. I want to make things right." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Do you even know what it was like for us? For Mom?" she demanded. "She worked so hard to keep things together after you left. She never complained, but we saw how tired she was, how much she struggled. And you just walked away." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Alexander's chest tightened. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't undo the pain I caused. I wish I could. But I want you to know that I regret every moment I missed with you, with all of you. I was selfish, and I made terrible mistakes. But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I mean it." Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she set down her pen and crossed her arms. "Words aren't enough," she said. "I know," Alexander replied. "And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm not going anywhere, Clara. I'll be here for as long as it takes." She didn't respond immediately, but the sharpness in her gaze softened just slightly. "I'll think about it," she said finally. It wasn't the answer Alexander had hoped for, but it was more than he expected. He stood and gave her a small nod. "We'll be at the museum if you change your mind," he said before leaving her room. A day of discovery. Despite Clara's absence, the outing with the other children was a success. At the museum, Leo's excitement was infectious as he dragged Alexander from one exhibit to the next, peppering him with questions about dinosaurs, space exploration, and ancient civilizations. Max, armed with a museum scavenger hunt checklist, raced ahead, determined to find every item on the list. Lily stayed close to Alexander, her quiet demeanor contrasting with her brother's energy. She spent most of her time in the art and history sections, sketching sculptures and artifacts in her notebook. Watching his children engage with the exhibits filled Alexander with a deep sense of gratitude. He had missed so much of their lives, but these moments felt like a small step toward making up for lost time. During lunch, Leo asked a question that caught Alexander off guard. "Did you ever take us to places like this when we were little?" Alexander hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "No," he admitted. "I didn't, and I regret that more than you know." Leo nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you're here now," he said, offering a small smile. Alexander's chest tightened with emotion. "And I'll keep being here," he said firmly. Clara's choice. When Alexander returned the children to Charlotte's house that evening, Clara was waiting in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, but her expression was less guarded than it had been that morning. "How was the museum?" she asked, her tone neutral. "It was great," Leo said, launching into a detailed account of the exhibits they had seen. Clara listened quietly, her gaze occasionally flicking toward Alexander. When the younger children went upstairs to unpack, she stayed behind. "I thought about what you said," she told Alexander, her voice measured. "And?" he prompted, his heart pounding. "I still don't trust you," she said bluntly. "But I'm willing to give you a chance. Just don't mess it up." A wave of relief washed over Alexander. "I won't," he promised. "Thank you, Clara. It means a lot." She nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "We'll see," she said before heading upstairs. A turning point. That night, as Alexander drove back to his apartment, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Winning back his children's trust would take time, patience, and effort. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Charlotte's words rang in his ears. "This isn't about you. It's about them." He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. His children were worth it. The weight of redemption. The following weeks were a delicate dance for Alexander, balancing his burgeoning bond with his children and the heavy shadow of his past mistakes. Every interaction with them felt like a step on a tightrope. One wrong move, and he feared he'd undo all the progress he had made. His patience was tested, but for the first time in his life, he understood that the things worth fighting for required not only effort but vulnerability. An unexpected gesture. One crisp Saturday morning, Alexander arrived at Charlotte's home to find Clara waiting by the front door, her arms folded. The other children were nowhere in sight, and Charlotte was in the background, quietly observing from the kitchen. "What's going on?" Alexander asked, cautious but curious. Clara hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I want to go somewhere," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Okay," Alexander replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Where do you want to go?" Clara looked up at him, her expression serious. "You'll see," she said. "But it's not for fun. It's something I need to show you." Charlotte stepped into the doorway, her face a mixture of concern and quiet approval. "She came to me with the idea last night," Charlotte said softly. "I think it's important. Be patient with her." "I will," Alexander promised. Clara climbed into his car, her movements stiff and deliberate. The drive was silent, save for the hum of the engine. She gave him directions without elaboration, her gaze fixed out the window. Alexander didn't push her to explain, sensing that whatever this was, it mattered deeply to her. Finally, they arrived at a small community center on the edge of town. The building was modest, its brick exterior showing signs of age, but it exuded a quiet sense of purpose. Clara got out of the car and motioned for Alexander to follow. Inside, the center bustled with activity. Volunteers moved purposefully through the halls, carrying boxes of supplies and chatting with visitors. Clara led Alexander to a brightly lit room filled with tables and chairs. Several children sat at the tables, engaged in various activities: drawing, reading, and playing board games. "This is where Mom brought us after you left," Clara said quietly, her voice barely audible over the chatter. Alexander's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "She brought us here every weekend," Clara explained. "When she was working double shifts and couldn't afford childcare, this place was our safe space. The volunteers here helped us with our homework, played games with us, and made us feel like we weren't alone." Alexander's throat constricted. He had spent so many years convincing himself that his departure had been a clean break, that his absence hadn't truly affected them. But standing in this room, hearing Clara's words, he was confronted with the undeniable truth. His choices had forced Charlotte and the children to rely on strangers to fill the void he had left. Clara turned to face him, her eyes brimming with unspoken emotion. "I wanted you to see this," she said, her voice firm. I wanted you to understand what we went through while you were off living your new life. This place saved us." "I'm so sorry, Clara," Alexander said, his voice thick with regret. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you, for your siblings, and for your mom. I failed all of you, and I'll carry that weight for the rest of my life." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Good," she said simply. Breaking through. Later that evening, Alexander sat in his apartment, staring at a photo of his children that Charlotte had given him weeks ago. The image was a candid shot of the four of them at a park, their smiles radiant and unguarded. It was a snapshot of the joy he had missed, a reminder of the life he had abandoned. He thought about Clara's words and the community center. He thought about Charlotte's quiet strength and the sacrifices she had made to keep their family afloat. And he thought about the trust he was still trying to rebuild. The next day, Alexander returned to the community center. This time, he came prepared. A new purpose. The children were surprised when Alexander announced his plan to take them back to the community center. Clara's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why do you want to go there?" she asked. "I want to give back," Alexander said simply, "to the place that helped you when I wasn't there." Clara didn't respond, but she didn't object either. At the center, Alexander introduced himself to the director, a kind but firm woman named Margaret. He explained his desire to volunteer, to contribute in whatever way he could. Margaret eyed him critically. "You're not the first parent to show up here, looking to make amends," she said. "But if you're serious, we could use an extra pair of hands." Over the next several weeks, Alexander became a regular presence at the center. He helped with tutoring sessions, organized games, and even fixed a broken bookshelf in the library. At first, Clara watched him from a distance, her skepticism evident. But gradually she began to soften, her guarded demeanor giving way to cautious curiosity. A family reunited. One Friday evening, as the family gathered at Charlotte's house for dinner, Clara made an unexpected announcement. "I want to go stargazing," she said, glancing at Alexander. "Can you take me?" Alexander's heart swelled. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the surge of emotion. That night, they drove to a quiet hill on the outskirts of town, far from the city lights. Clara set up her telescope, and Alexander helped her adjust the focus. As they gazed at the stars, Clara broke the silence. "You're different now," she said. Alexander nodded. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "For you, for your siblings, and for myself." Clara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I think you might actually mean it this time," she said. "I do," Alexander said firmly. For the first time, Clara smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. A new legacy. The air was crisp and filled with the faint scent of rain as Alexander stood in the backyard of Charlotte's house. Around him, the remnants of a family barbecue were scattered. Empty plates on the picnic table, a football lying forgotten in the grass, and laughter still lingering in the air from earlier in the day. The children had scattered, running inside to warm up after the sun dipped below the horizon. It was moments like these that Alexander had once taken for granted, or worse, ignored entirely. Now, every second spent with his children felt like a treasure, each smile and shared laugh a fragile but beautiful gift. Charlotte appeared on the porch, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to Alexander and leaned against the railing, her eyes scanning the yard. "They'd grown to like having you around," she said, her tone soft but measured. Alexander nodded. "I feel it. It's humbling." Charlotte sipped her tea, her gaze steady. "Humbling doesn't begin to describe what you've had to learn, Alex, but I'll give you credit. You've done the work." They needed to see that. He turned to her, his expression earnest. "And you? Do you believe I changed?" Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the soft glow of the porch light flicker against the gathering darkness. "I do," she said finally. But what matters most is that you've proven it to them. The test of commitment. Over the following weeks, Alexander began to notice a shift in his relationship with each of his children. They no longer seemed to treat his presence as a temporary experiment. Instead, they began inviting him into their world. Hesitant at first, but with increasing openness. Max, the youngest and boldest, became Alexander's shadow on weekends, always eager to pull him into games or adventures. One afternoon, as they hiked a forest trail, Max tugged on Alexander's sleeve. "Do you think you'll ever leave again?" Max asked, his voice innocent but filled with the kind of raw honesty only a child could muster. Alexander crouched down, meeting Max's curious eyes. "Never," he said, his voice firm. "I made that mistake once, and I'll never make it again. You're stuck with me, buddy." Max grinned and ran ahead, shouting over his shoulder, "Good, because I have a lot of plans for us." Lily, the quiet and creative middle child, had grown bolder in sharing her artwork. One evening, she shyly handed Alexander a drawing she had made of their family, a vibrant scene of all of them sitting in the backyard, laughing together. "It's beautiful," Alexander said, his voice tinged with awe. "You think so?" Lily asked, her eyes searching his face. "I do," he said sincerely. "And you've captured something really special here. It reminds me of how much I've missed, but also how much I still get to be a part of." Lily smiled, her cheeks flushing pink, and for the first time she hugged him. Leo, the ever-curious boy with an endless supply of questions, had grown closer to Alexander in a way that felt almost natural. During a visit to the Science Museum, Leo asked a question that Alexander had dreaded but knew was inevitable. "Why did you leave us?" The question was quiet, but it struck like a thunderclap. Alexander stopped walking and knelt to Leo's eye level. "I left because I thought I was doing what was best at the time," he admitted. "But I was wrong. I was selfish, and I didn't realize how much I was hurting all of you. I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Leo studied him for a long moment, his young face thoughtful. "But you're here now," he said. "I am," Alexander said, "and I'll never leave again." Leo nodded and reached for Alexander's hand, holding it tightly as they continued walking. Clara remained the hardest to reach, her walls still firmly in place despite her tentative moments of warmth. But one evening, as they sat on the hill where they often stargazed, she surprised him. "Do you ever wish you could go back and change things?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Every single day," Alexander replied without hesitation. Clara turned to him, her expression contemplative. "If you could change just one thing, what would it be?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I wouldn't have left," he said. "I would have stayed and fought for our family. I didn't realize it then, but you, your siblings, and your mom, you were the best thing I ever had. And I walked away from that." Clara's gaze softened, and for the first time, she placed her hand on his. "I'm glad you're here now," she said. A family reborn. Months later, as spring blossomed into summer, Alexander and Charlotte decided to host a neighborhood block party, a celebration of renewal and community. The children were thrilled, helping to decorate the yard with colorful streamers and balloons. Alexander manned the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with neighbors, while the children ran around, their laughter filling the air. Charlotte moved through the crowd with her usual grace, stopping to talk to old friends and new acquaintances alike. As the evening wore on, the family gathered around the fire pit in the backyard, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Max sat on Alexander's lap, sticky with melted chocolate, while Leo told an animated tale of their latest museum trip. Lily showed off her latest sketchbook, and Clara, to everyone's surprise, joined in the laughter, her usual guardedness momentarily forgotten. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a profound sense of belonging. He wasn't just rebuilding his family. He was becoming part of their lives in a way he had never imagined. A legacy of love. One evening, long after the block party, Charlotte found Alexander sitting on the porch, gazing at the stars. She joined him, handing him a glass of wine. "They adore you," she said softly. Alexander smiled, his eyes still fixed on the sky. "I don't deserve it," he said, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to it." Charlotte placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way, Alex. Don't forget to give yourself some credit." He turned to her, his expression earnest. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. She smiled, her eyes glinting with something unspoken. "Just keep showing up for them," she said. "That's all they've ever wanted." As the night deepened, Alexander felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He had made mistakes, and the road to redemption had been long and fraught with challenges. But in the end, he had found his way back to the people who mattered most. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Bennett felt whole. Building forever. The glow of the fire pit dwindled to embers as the night deepened. The children had gone inside, leaving Alexander and Charlotte alone under the stars. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the warm evening air, a soothing backdrop to the weight of their shared history. Charlotte sipped her wine and glanced at Alexander, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, "when you left, I didn't think you'd ever look back. I thought you'd made peace with walking away for good." Alexander set his glass down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I thought I had too," he admitted. "But I wasn't at peace. I was running. And no matter how far I ran, it didn't fill the emptiness I felt." Charlotte nodded, her eyes fixed on the fading firelight. "I tried to hate you," she confessed. "I wanted to, but there were moments when I missed the man you used to be. The one who would light up when he saw the kids, who would laugh with me about the silliest things. I lost that man," Alexander said softly. "But I'm trying to find him again. For them, and for me." Charlotte studied him, her gaze piercing but not unkind. "You're getting there," she said. "But remember, Alex, redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey, one you'll have to keep walking every single day." "I know," he said, meeting her eyes. "And I'm ready for that." A milestone moment. The next weekend, Clara surprised everyone by suggesting a family outing. A trip to a local lake where the children had spent countless summers before Alexander had left. "I want to show Dad the dock," Clara said matter-of-factly, her tone betraying none of the sentiment behind her words. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. The lake had been a sacred place for the family, a spot where they had made some of their happiest memories. For Clara to suggest returning there with Alexander was a monumental step. The drive to the lake was filled with excited chatter from the younger children, while Clara sat quietly in the front seat, her expression unreadable. When they arrived, the sight of the shimmering water and the familiar old dock brought a rush of nostalgia that hit Alexander like a wave. Clara led the way, her siblings trailing behind her. The dock was weathered but still sturdy, its wooden planks sun-bleached from years of use. Clara sat at the edge, dangling her feet over the water, and the others quickly joined her. Alexander hesitated for a moment before sitting beside Clara. "This is where we used to come every summer," Clara said, her voice distant. "Mom would pack sandwiches, and we'd spend the whole day swimming and fishing. It was one of the few times we all felt normal." Alexander nodded, his heart aching at the memories he had missed. "It's beautiful here," he said quietly. Clara turned to him, her expression serious. "We used to talk about you, you know," she said. "Max and Leo were too little to really understand, but Lily and I, we wondered if you ever thought about us, if you ever regretted leaving." "I did," Alexander said, his voice steady. "Every day. But I didn't know how to come back. I was too ashamed of what I'd done, too afraid to face the pain I caused. I convinced myself you were better off without me." Clara looked out over the water, her face thoughtful. "You were wrong," she said finally. "I know," Alexander replied. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." A symbol of healing. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the lake, Max ran up with a small fishing rod he had found in the shed near the dock. "Dad, can you help me fish?" he asked, his eyes bright with excitement. Alexander smiled and stood, taking the rod from Max and showing him how to cast it. The other children joined in, laughing and cheering whenever someone got a bite. Even Clara couldn't resist the infectious energy, her usual reserve giving way to genuine joy. At one point, as the children gathered around the small bucket of fish they had caught, Clara turned to Alexander. "This feels good," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but steady. "It does," he said. A step forward. When they returned home that evening, the children were exhausted but happy. As Alexander helped Charlotte carry things inside, she paused in the doorway, her expression contemplative. "They're happy," she said, her voice soft. "It's been a long time since I've seen them like this." Alexander smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment settling over him. "They deserve happiness," he said, "and I'll do whatever it takes to keep giving them that." Charlotte studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're doing good, Alex," she said. "Just don't lose sight of what matters." "I won't," he promised. A new chapter. Months passed, and the family began to settle into a new rhythm. Alexander's presence became a constant, not just for the children but for Charlotte as well. While their relationship remained rooted in co-parenting, a sense of mutual respect and understanding had grown between them. One evening, as the children worked on a school project in the living room, Charlotte pulled Alexander aside. "Have you thought about what's next for you?" she asked. Alexander frowned. "What do you mean?" "For your life," Charlotte clarified. "You've spent so much time focusing on the kids, and I'm grateful for that. But what about your career? Your future?" Alexander considered her words. His old life of corporate deals and lavish parties felt like a distant memory, a life that no longer fit who he had become. "I think I want to do something meaningful," he said slowly. "Something that gives back. Maybe I'll start working with the community center full-time." Charlotte smiled, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "I think that suits you," she said. A family united. On a quiet Sunday evening, the family gathered in the backyard to watch a meteor shower. Clara set up her telescope, while Max and Leo sprawled on a blanket, pointing out the constellations they had learned about. Lily sketched the night sky, her pencil capturing the magic of the moment. Alexander sat beside Charlotte, a quiet peace settling over him as he watched his children. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, not just as their father, but as a part of their lives. As a particularly bright meteor streaked across the sky, Clara leaned over and whispered, "Thanks for staying, Dad." Alexander's chest swelled with emotion. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. And in that moment, under the endless expanse of stars, Alexander knew that the life he had now, this messy, beautiful, imperfect life, was the greatest gift he could have ever received.